Long-term shareholders expect both returns and significant commitments to sustainability and social purpose. Some companies have faced considerable backlash on issues that CEOs just 30 years ago would have called soft. So how can the board set the right tone at the top, and how can you prepare your company to be measured? I'm Al Dominic, the host of Looking Ahead, and we tackled this topic earlier today as part of our Avoiding a Corporate Crisis event at NASDAQ's market site. We filmed Evan Harvey, the global head of sustainability at NASDAQ, and are pleased to share his perspectives in this special episode of Looking Ahead.
I want to talk about 5 things basically today, and I'll go through them rather quickly. In my role here at NASDAQ, I have, I think, some interesting perspective on all 5. One would be the evolution of corporate sustainability, how it's changed over the years. I'm going to talk about board opportunities and board risks in sustainability/ESG. I'm going to talk about some of the current topics that are out there in the news, things that you've heard about, things that are affecting our jobs. And then I want to focus at the end a little bit on the language of sustainability and how sometimes language in particular can be a translation layer, an effective translation layer, and a really disruptive translation layer between activists, shareholders, investors, board members, employees, and the management of the company. So it's important to think about things in terms of the language that we use when we discuss these topics. And even the topic of this talk, talking about corporate sustainability, I tend to use the term ESG. Sustainability got to ESG via a sort of evolutionary process that I'll talk a little bit at the end. But I want to talk at the beginning about the evolution of corporate sustainability. For those of you who may not know or may not have seen Blackbaud and everybody running around here today, it's Giving Tuesday. Giving Tuesday is sort of the antidote to Black Friday. It's a thing that's been around for about 10 years where companies focus on community service and volunteerism and philanthropy for a 24-hour period, always the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So we have Blackbaud, a listed company here today, doing a bunch of media. We did a bell ringing this morning. NASDAQ is doing a program today focused on homelessness and homelessness charities. So all of our employees that donate today get triple matching on their dollars for 24 hours to certain homelessness charities. But most companies, a lot of companies around the world who do community service focus on Giving Tuesday as an aspect of their brand. So it's interesting that this idea didn't exist. We've transitioned from a sales focus on Black Friday to this sort of more charitable focus for a lot of brands on Giving Tuesday. My function, per Al's description at the beginning, it didn't really exist 10 years ago. I've been at the exchange for 15, but not in this role. This role didn't exist at stock exchanges until around 2010. Around that time, there were only 2 or 3 stock exchanges in the world. There were about 85 or 90. Had any kind of ESG program or sustainability program. They were doing very little outreach to listed companies. They were certainly not doing a lot of reporting on their own. Even though a lot of stock exchanges have since become public companies run by their own boards with their own shareholders, ESG was a little bit late in the game for us as an industry, as opposed to tech and consumer and some other places. But now I'm happy to report 10 years later that my role is very common at stock exchanges. We have a couple of working groups in the industry, one at the Trade Association, one at the UN, focused on all kinds of things related to ESG, index creation, disclosure standards, how to measure the unmeasurable, all kinds of things related to ESG is now a commonplace practice, and sometimes it's just not just a person, it could be a team at a lot of exchanges. And then I think the other thing that's changed in the last 10 years, and this is a bit of a personal opinion, is the sort of willingness of corporations and CEOs to be forthright on values, brands taking stands. In the last 10 years, we've seen things like the Business Roundtable letter, which I'll talk a little bit later, which is advocating an expansion of stakeholder interests when you manage a company. We've seen CEOs sign letters on issues as diverse as immigration, gun control, LGBTQ rights, pulling out of certain jurisdictions where they perceive anti-LGBTQ policies in place. So I think there's been a transition over the last 10 years, particularly from the C-suite, but also from companies willing to associate their brand with more progressive causes. They have obviously, I presume, looked at it and see more value than risk in being out front on some of those issues, either in the attraction of employees, the attraction of customers, as opposed to the risk it might presume for the company. So let's talk a little bit about board function in particular, because I presume that's really why we're here. So board opportunities and board risks when it comes to sustainability. I think that the 3 opportunities that I want to identify in terms of board participation and sustainability are fairly obvious, and you probably know them, but maybe it's helpful to restate them. First and foremost, the board does have strategic oversight for the company. The board can touch all verticals within a company. So it's probably uniquely situated to look at a multidisciplinary effort like sustainability ESG, which can touch facilities, CFO, HR, employee health and safety, the C-suite, marketing and communications. There are very few organizational bodies that have that purview that can actually direct strategy and look at things in terms of the integration of that over the long term. I would suggest that boards are one of those bodies that have that power if they choose to do so. I think that the board, at least in theory, is sufficiently long-term in perspective. They can afford to absent themselves from a quarter or a year and look at the long-term health and viability of the company. A lot of what happens in sustainability, ESG, is a long fuse. It takes some investment. It takes some time to see the payoff. There's no instant fix. There's no Band-Aid unless you're emerging from a crisis and you need to put a PR plan together. This is something that requires time, and time to do well, time to get the story out there in an effective way. The board, in theory, is incented to look more long-term and to take that kind of distant view on the management of the company and where the long-term prospects of the company are best served. And then finally, we're going to talk about BRT and the expansion of shareholder interest, but I think it's fairly safe to assume that the board will never lose track of the concept of shareholder value and shareholder return. They're always going to have that in their mind. They're never going to be so divorced from shareholder return that they go too activist on ESG or too progressive on ESG. The board, maybe more than any other body within the company, maintains that focus, at least in my experience. And I've worked with hundreds of NASDAQ companies on ESG intervention, ESG messaging, ESG communications, program building. And that tends to be what I hear back from board members, is that they are interested in ESG, they feel like it might be an emerging part of their purview, but they are not necessarily going to divorce themselves from shareholder value. They're interested in building long-term value in the company, and they want to know how ESG sustainability contributes to that, not something they're doing as an extra tick box to please a specialist audience. And then let's talk about some of the more obvious risks. To me, there are three that stand out, and I'll give you a couple of examples. First and foremost, there's the idea of improper command and control. Everything I just said about boards and boards having purview and boards having the perspective in order to manage ESG and sustainability well, when they don't do that, when there's a crisis, boards are often in the crosshairs in terms of where did it all go wrong. Sometimes it's C-suite, but sometimes it's the board. And then we've seen, particularly in the recent years with the environmental crisis at Volkswagen, we've seen some of the things that went on at Wells Fargo, we've seen the disaster at PG&E. Boards got a share of that blame for not sufficiently exercising long-term risk oversight. They weren't looking at things like climate as a potential destructive force on the company. And they didn't really see, or at least publicly, they didn't project an idea about how those things could be detrimental to long-term value. So certainly there's a sense that you're at risk for not being checked in on this topic, whether or not you're public about it or not. And number two would be all kinds of backlash from being too progressive on certain issues. If you're going to go out there for gun control, go out there for immigration rights, you're going to alienate almost as many people as you attract. So that's a value judgment that you have to make on your own. If you are particularly progressive on gun rights, are you alienating potential customers, B2C customers, B2B customers who may have a different point of view? And of course, this plays into the highly politicized environment that we're all operating in now, where people tend to divide things up into us and them. So it really is a particularly thorny calculus to say we want to be on the record on this issue, and we're okay if these people don't shop with us anymore, or we're okay if these people won't work here anymore, and we're okay if people think our brand is somehow aligned with something that they're not aligned with. That's a thing that boards are having to consider more and more now. And especially, and the life cycle on that kind of outrage, the life cycle on that kind of pushback used to be long. It used to take time for scandals to emerge. Now it can be lightning quick. Social media, all kinds of other things, stuff happens fast. So I often hear from board members, particularly board members who are adept at social media, a real concern about exposure on ESG and sustainability matters and how that could or could not touch the board. And then finally, I think that both a risk and an opportunity for boards has to do with diversity. For a long time in the ESG space, the topic du jour on boards would be board diversity. The thinking is that the more diverse the board is, the better run it is, the more effective management tool it is. And board diversity used to be measured just in terms of gender, how many women are on the board. There is compelling evidence out there that correlates diverse gender boards and financial outperformance. I don't know why it is. We don't really have causation. We only have correlation. But you can draw a line between boards that have opened up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 board spots to women and performance in other ways. This could be illusion or it could be real. But there is definitely a correlation. There are numerous studies out there that can point to financial returns and financial positives, dollar-saving positives related to diverse boards. And from my point of view, I'm sort of agnostic. It could be that the company is just smarter. Maybe the company integrates more decision makers generally. Maybe the company has promoted more women throughout the value chain, so they're getting that diversity of decision making throughout the company. Or maybe there's something special about the decision making process that happens at the board by virtue of having these diverse voices in the room. And of course, diversity is no longer just gender. In fact, gender is no longer just gender. Diversity now is ethnicity and experience, and board turnover is an important topic now as it never used to be. Now you have people who are looking at boards and trying to find out how many other boards do you serve on? How much attention can you give to my company if you're a part of 12 other boards? And there's sort of a pushback against the established, experienced, multi-board seat holder. All right, so let's talk a little bit about current topics. There are things that are in the news that touch on this that might be interesting to you to discuss. First and foremost, I want to talk about the Business Roundtable letter. So for those of you that don't know, famously about 15 years ago, the Business Roundtable published a letter signed by several CEOs that basically said, the shareholder, the investor, is our primary concern when we're in the company. This is really why we are in this business. We're in this business to create and return value for shareholders, investors. And that was the prevailing attitude, especially in the US, ever since. I would argue it was the prevailing attitude well before, too. So I don't know what the reason was for the BRT putting it out at that time, but it certainly was something that resonated in corporate America. Half of our company, half of my job is in Europe. So this is a different conversation in Europe than it is in the US. This idea that shareholder is the only thing that matters to a company's operation is so foreign in foreign places that it is actually night and day, some of the conversations that I've had with listings in Sweden, listings in Denmark, listings in Finland, listings in Iceland, where they tend to think of the social impact of companies as part of the game and table stakes for operation. Our CEO signed the letter. I was proud that she signed the letter. The letter that just came out recently expands the definition of stakeholders for corporate operation to include things like employees, communities, businesses that are impacted, supply chain. Not that you're devaluing or even putting shareholder in the second place, but you are free to, or the idea is that you should be free to consider other audiences when you manage the business. The impact of the company on that business could have long-term consequences for the company. Financial consequences too, not just social consequences. So that's in the news right now. There are certain companies that signed the letter and are proud about it. There are certain companies that didn't sign it and are hiding the fact they haven't signed it. And then I think the pushback since the letter has came out earlier this year has been from NGOs and standard setters and activists who basically say, prove it to me. You signed this letter, you put your signature on it. How do we know you're actually living out these values? Which is something we hear back from the PRI. So the PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment, virtually every large asset manager and owner on earth is a signatory of the PRI from the UN that says we're going to be ESG owners, we're going to be ESG mindful, we're going to vote our values, we're going to divest if necessary, we're going to invest in companies that outperform. And the push since the PRI became public has always been, how are you proving that? How are you living that out? Prove to me that you are behind the scenes working with companies to make them better on ESG if this is such a decision-making tool for you. The same thing's happening with the BRT letter. Those 180 CEOs that signed it are getting besieged with requests for more data, more information about how they expect to live out that promise. And I'm going to turn to data at the end because I think all roads lead to data, all roads lead to ESG as we talk about this topic. Some other things that bubble up to board purview that I think are emerging disciplines in management of a modern corporation, certainly enterprise risk management, taking this broader view of how many different factors might impact the company's ability to survive and make money in the future. You cannot avoid, would argue, you cannot avoid a topic like climate change in that analysis. If you are building factories in floodplains, if you have significant worker bases near places where there's no fresh water, if you are in storm-ravaged parts of the world or increasingly storm-ravaged parts of the world, if you are employing people in a factory where the living wage is so perilously close to poverty that you may not have that workforce anymore. These are all considerations that fall within ESG that the board should at least be looking at if they're taking an enterprise risk approach to the management of the business. Looking at all the factors in the world that could contribute to the success or failure of our company. Even if you choose not to be public about it, even if you choose not to put out a sustainability report or to report to one of these ESG ratings firms, having this information in hand is a great tool. You want to have this performance measurement data in hand so that you can manage the business more effectively, even if you don't tell a soul about it outside of the company. You don't necessarily have to publicize your risks. You just have to know what they are. The other topic that's emerging in American corporations is the concept of human capital management. The idea that humans as a management tool have to be treated in a different way. They're not just tick boxes. And some of the things that play into sustainability and ESG are definitely related to human capital metrics, human capital management. ESG being more progressive on some of these issues, having a sustainability report, being on the topic when it comes to climate or social issues, tends to attract younger workers, tends to attract tech workers in particular who have this as a disproportionate concern. It tends to keep people at the company longer than they would stay normally. There are all kinds of studies out there that talk about length of service, attraction, even potentially taking a lower salary to work for a company where they align with the values as opposed to ones where they don't. So in terms of looking at the dollar signs associated with human capital management, sustainability and ESG is a part of that analysis as well. And then I think where I want to get to here is this sort of last step, which is the emergence of measurement. For a long time, sustainability was this vague, nebulous topic about doing good or doing right or trying to be more progressive or trying to be more socially responsible. And I think that the worm in the US, it's changed elsewhere first, but in the US, it's definitely turned towards data. It's turned towards what are the KPIs or the performance indicators that prove to me that we're moving in the right direction, or that we're at least measuring where we are. We're understanding if we have any performance gaps. And I think that there are certain emerging firms that have done a good job in pushing this forward in the US. So for a long time, there was the Carbon Disclosure Project, you might have heard of, CDP, asked for voluntary disclosures from companies about their energy profile and their emissions. There's the Global Reporting Initiative based in Amsterdam, which is the largest sustainability reporting organization in the world. 25,000 companies report to it voluntarily. Basically create a report, here's the standards, send it to us, and we'll put it on the website for anybody to see. There's no charge. In this country, we have had lately the emergence of a new version of sustainability reporting called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is taking a slightly different approach from the GRI. The GRI asks for hundreds of different data points related to sustainability. SASB takes a different approach by saying there are 6 or 7 key themes in your sector, in your industry, that are meaningful. The board should know about these and should be managing them actively. If you can provide me the information and the data related to those 6 or 7 things, I don't need to know about anything else. For an investor in particular, and SASB's really pitched at investors, that's the decision-making criteria that I need to decide whether your company is worthwhile or not everything else that might be asked for by some other body. We had the emergence lately of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. I'm throwing a lot of acronyms at you, but it's an acronym-laden world, unfortunately. This was started by Bloomberg and Mark Carney at the Bank of England, and this is the next generation of climate reporting beyond CDP. This asked for things other than give me your emissions number, give me your total energy consumption. Instead, give me your scenario planning, board-level scenario planning around what happens to this company in a 2-degree world or a 2.5-degree world. How much do things go south? How much of your supply chain is jeopardized? How much is the cost of energy going to be threatened if you don't model this out into the future? And they specifically asked the board to have oversight into that exercise and to publish the results. A lot of boards don't do that. Most people don't publish SASB information right now, but it is interesting to think of importing this new discipline into board management, looking at things that are directly related to climate in particular as a long-term risk and a management tool for the company. And then last but not least, what the exchanges have done. I mentioned that just about every exchange on Earth has some sort of ESG person in place or team in place. Most of them are part of one of those 2 working groups that I mentioned. 60 of the 85 have put out ESG guidance for listed companies on a voluntary basis. They put out these documents, as we have, to listed companies saying, if you care about this, if you want to engage with long-term minded investors, if you're trying to figure out how to measure this stuff, here are the metrics that we find meaningful. Here's the business case for all of them. None of it rooted in the ethical or moral argument, all of it rooted in the financial argument. This is the reason why you should do this. If you choose to do it, here you can do it. 10 or 12 exchanges have explicit ESG disclosure rules on the books. There are certain disclosures you have to give to the exchange on an annual basis or you can't list there. That's still the outlier. Most exchanges like NASDAQ, like NYSE, have a voluntary regimen in place. And we've had a fair amount of participation on that voluntary basis. So I want to turn really quickly to what I mentioned at the beginning, and then I'll get to a couple of questions. One, it's about the language of sustainability, and I'm a frustrated English major. I didn't come into this from financial services or environmental services. I came into it from the communication side. And I often thought that part of the problem that we get into with sustainability is we don't know what to call things, and we put the wrong labels on things, and people bring their own prejudices to those labels. So I want to talk about a few groups. In terms of companies, how has this topic emerged over time? So companies, years ago, this used to fall into sort of community relations. This was the nice thing that we're doing through a side part of the business that is helping communities in some vague way. And then it turned into community service. How can we sort of marshal our volunteer force at the company to do some good and to tell our story in a better way? And then it became philanthropy and foundations. So what we do with the corporate foundation to support certain charities, maybe the CEO has a pet charity that they want to support, and how do we get employees involved with donations, or how does the company make a large-scale donation in response to, say, disaster relief? That became corporate social responsibility, then it was part of employee health and safety, and then I would suggest that everything sort of ended up here at ESG, where companies are now more concerned with ESG rankings and ratings, trying to figure out what the performance indicators are for an internal dashboard or an external report when they're trying to figure out what they're doing and how effective it's been. For investors, years ago, this was called responsible investing or socially responsible investing. These were small shops looking at very specific companies doing specific things and trying to create impact. So it also became impact investing. I want to fix the rainforest. I want to fix labor rights in sub-Saharan Africa. I want to fix the way coffee holders work on plantations. Now, as I mentioned before, it's just about every large asset owner and asset manager on earth, at least on paper, saying that ESG is part of their decision-making matrix. This is BlackRock, this is State Street, this is just about everybody. And we can argue about how active they've been in working that promise, but at least on paper, they're saying that this is a value that we consider vital in our decision-making. Exchanges, I talked a little bit about exchanges. Certainly for us, this started as a corporate governance initiative because a lot of us are SROs, a lot of us have heavy regulatory engagement, so we have to demonstrate our market value and our market stewardship and our transparency in different ways. But it quickly grew into helping listed companies with this program, and then where we are now is essentially looking at this land rush of products and services. There's so much thirst out there to move capital into more sustainable ESG positive directions that exchanges, just like every financial services company, are trying to create indexes, bonds, products, corporate services, workflow tools that help the company manage this process and help the company get their story out there in a more effective way. As they have come to us and said, we need more help on doing this, we need to know what the right standards are, we need to know what the right metrics are, we need to know how to tell this story. Exchanges have met that need, stepping in sometimes between the regulator and the company to try to be that neutral third party that says, this is what we think is valuable. And then, last but not least, what is ESG? I've been throwing it around pretty casually up here. To me, ESG is three things, and I'll leave you with these just to be a little cheeky. ESG is definitely an exercise in measuring the unmeasurable. Of course, we could put a number on emissions. We could put a number on energy consumption. We know how much water is used or reclaimed. What's the number we put on human rights? What's the number or the metric that we put on, anti-trafficking? What's the number or the metric that we put on the value of diversity to the bottom line? These are very difficult things to measure. ESG is also, depending on who you talk to in the US and how cynical they are, everything that's not in the 10Q or 10K, which is why sometimes it's called non-financial information. ESG is 600 or 700 different data points now if you look in the Bloomberg terminal. It covers everything. Everything that you traditionally won't find in a US financial filing. So it tends to be meaningful for that reason or less meaningful for that reason, depending on your point of view. And then finally, as I mentioned at the outset, I think that ESG is definitely about data. It's data at the core, it's data measurement at the core. It's a disciplined science around how do we measure what's good and what's bad, and how do I compare apples to apples within an industry, specifically for investors, and figure out where the good actors are and the bad actors are. It's no longer the 100-page PDF about all the great volunteerism that your company is doing. It's more about a data table and people wanting to take that information and build it into their own algorithm and spit out value.